I want to believe with all my heart that Dan Hurley is in the arms of Jesus. I want to believe that. And I can't stand here and tell you that today. I can't. I can tell you that myself and Tom, Frankie, and others spent a lot of time with him talking about his faith. And it usually went some strange place. I'll tell you that my heart aches. It's like fishing. You get that one right up there by the boat to the point it's banging its head against the side of the boat, and when you reach down, it falls off the hook. And that's kind of the loss that I feel with Dan at times. You know, a lot of you guys see me worked up and mad. I want you to know I'm not mad. I'm brokenhearted. Because I know that Jesus Christ has a better life for each one of you. And sometimes it's very difficult to watch people make the same stupid mistakes over and over again. And yet, the joy of all of it is that God's called us to love you. He never said I had to like you. He never said I had to like the stuff you did. Dan would put a place on your heart that will never be erased. Strange. Honest to goodness, when we first got the call, we were pretty certain that couldn't be right because Dan was indestructible. And someone called and said, I guess he finally used up that 9th life. I remember the first night I met him. You know how strange life can be? I said, how's that, Dan? I served my country. Not a problem. Came home, I was fine. Went out for some drinks. Dropped my cigarettes into the road. Walked out there to get him. Got hit by a truck. I will never know why I asked the question the way I did. I said, Dan, what'd you learn from that? I now put my cigarettes inside my No way. I said, you know, Dan, smoking kills. And he said, yeah, damn near did. Funny, and yet sad. You know, I can remember, we sat there, and Sarah and I, and we talked with him, and he'd start doing his thing. Somewhere between complete genius and complete insanity. And I remember one night at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was walking out of the shelter, and he usually would ask me the meaning of life at 2 or 2:30. He couldn't ask me at 11. He had to ask me as I was walking out the door. But this particular night, he started telling me about he had this formula he was doing for NASA. By the way, is anyone from NASA here today? Because I halfway expected him to show up. And he's writing this thing down, and I just was not in the mood. I was tired. I needed some sleep. And I looked at it. And he says, Pastor Scott, look right here. I said, oh, Dan, it's wrong. You sure? I said, it's wrong, Dan. He went right over and I walked over to Tom and I said, I don't know if you remember this. I said, Tom, if you want to do yourself a favor tonight, Tom was going to spend the night. And I said, if he comes over to you with that formula, you glance at it quickly, because you're going to do with all your confidence in the world. You tell him it's wrong, I said, we'll keep him busy the rest of the night. And it did. My last big time with Dan was just a couple weeks ago. If you've ever seen him naked, you'll be scarred for life. I'm getting counseling. He's sitting in the shower naked. I said, Tim, what the? Get out of there. Pastor Scott, I know you love me. I tell you this because I did love you. We love you guys. But my heart breaks that I cannot stand here today and tell you with all the confidence in the world that Dan's in a better place. That hurts. And that's a pain that I don't deal with very well. We've buried too many of y'all. And I suspect we'll bury more. But my hope is that as we sit here today and consider Dan's life, that we also learn from it in some way. And that somehow when we leave here today, that we will each leave here differently than we came.
Daniel Francis Hurley. Danny. D. Hurley. Mr. Hurley. D.F. Hurley. Dapper Dan. U.S. Navy veteran Daniel Francis Hurley. Sailor Daniel Francis Hurley. How about American hero Dan Hurley? No matter what name we called him, no matter what name was on his birth certificate, to most of us gathered here today to reminisce, to remember, to recall this little short wobbly guy that Pastor Scott imitated so well. We knew him simply as Dirty Dan. Daniel Francis Hurley. Danny. D. Hurley. Mr. Hurley. D.F. Hurley. Dapper Dan. U.S. Navy veteran Daniel Francis Hurley. Sailor Daniel Francis Hurley. How about American hero Dan Hurley? No matter what name we called him, no matter what name was on his birth certificate, to most of us gathered here today to reminisce, to remember, to recall this little short wobbly guy that Pastor Scott imitated so well. We knew him simply as Dirty Dan. And you would agree that you either had to love Dirty Dan or hate him. And most would agree, loving him or hating him, but hate is a very, very strong word. But the word hate actually means to push away. So we either loved him or hated him. Cindy and I spent many days, many hours, many weeks with Mr. Dan Hurley, who was a guest in our home often. And we'd see glimpses of him during his sober time. And you could actually see and look in his eyes and see how intelligent Dan Hurley was. In fact, Dan would often ramble on about nuclear science, about NASA, about these long, drawn-out algebra problems that I had no clue. But he could name every star visible to the naked eye from what I know. He could point out, tell you where they were, what constellation. He would ask pointed questions concerning the condition of man's soul in relationship to God. Dan Hurley would. He would share his hurts and disappointments in his life, and disappointments he had as he walked on this earth. The pain of being the town drunk. My wife Cindy says that Dan Hurley is the poster child for a homeless drunk. Dan Hurley knew that, and during his sober time often felt ashamed, but he made it out to be a joke. And some of you folks who live outside know that you often use humor to keep yourself from crying. Dan was a part of our community. And just because he had no place to lay his head, just because he might have been pushed away a little bit too often, just because he was homeless, just because he drank, just because he did drugs, just because he was a little bit dirty or his pants was falling down or he smelled a little bad today, it doesn't mean that he wasn't a part of our community. It doesn't mean that we didn't care. It doesn't mean that most of us here did not love Dapper Dan. Because we did, but so did God. And because God loved Dapper Dan, we were remembering his life today at this memorial. And for the most part, Dan had us listed as his next of kin. We're his family. So technically, this is Dirty Dan's funeral. This is it, folks. And this is some tough stuff for me. I don't know about anybody else. But I started thinking what the Bible said about funerals and mourning, and it might be difficult to believe what the Bible says it's actually good for us to be here today. Ecclesiastes says it's better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of every person, and the living should take this to heart. So in other words, God's saying that it's better to go to a funeral than a birthday party, and it's better to go to a cemetery than a football game. You go, whoa, that sounds wrong. But there are a few reasons for this. This is a time for us to celebrate the life that God gave to Dan. Dan was created in what? In the image of God. Jesus loved Dan. He loved Dan enough to go to the cross for him, just like he went to the cross for you and I. So we celebrate the life today that Dan was giving. Regardless of how Dan chose how to live, he was still created in the image of God. But we also want to remember Dan's life. And he was a unique and one-of-a-kind individual. He could make you angry when you wanted to choke him in one breath, and then the next one you want to hug him and weep or laugh with him. He would often ask, how you doing, Pastor Frankie? You know I love you, like he said to Scott from the shower floor naked. But don't let that word get out. It would ruin my image, he would say. So a memorial or a funeral is a time for us to remember, but it's also a time for closure, and it's a time for us to say goodbye to somebody that we might have cared greatly for. To me, one of the most important reasons for a service, though, is it's a time to look at our own lives. Our lives. Not Dan's, but ours. And it's a really good time to ask some tough questions. Questions like, am I ready to die? Where will I go if I was to get hit by a car and die today? And so we're going to remember, we're going to say goodbye, we're going to reflect on our own lives too. Dan had an unexpected death. Pastor Scott may have been expecting it in the past. Karen might have been expecting it. My wife might have been expecting it to happen sooner rather than later, but I don't think Dan Hurley expected to die that night. I don't think Dan expected it at all. And for some of you here today that are living a lifestyle that is similar to Dapper Dan's or Dirty Dan's or Dan Hurley or this great American hero, you might be saying, whoa, where's God?